All right, well, good evening. Thank you all for coming once again. Got lesson number 4, designing for resource security, how your yard and your landscape and your design can be a way to save energy, save money, produce things that you want from your yard, just kind of up the whole security factor a little bit so that you have a little less fear, a little more sense of abundance. So what we're going to cover tonight then, looking at what it makes sense for you to grow in your yard, how to make decisions about what to grow. That's really, as I've said many times before, permaculture is a decision-making tool. And so one of the things we're going to do tonight is give you some guidelines for how to decide what should you be growing, what's going to be most appropriate for your conditions. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on microclimates in your yard, because just the way that your yard can be set up to mitigate climate as it gets to you, as it enters your yard, really, can really help you save money, save energy, make your yard a lot more livable, cool it off on hot days, warm it up on cool days, extend the growing season for you, save energy in your house, all sorts of things like that. So I will spend a fair amount of time tonight on creating good microclimates, and also just how that can be used to save energy, how you can do landscape design, not only to save energy, but the next point then is how to make decisions about using energy in your house and how your yard can actually become a source of fuel for at least reducing some of your energy needs in the house. And I'm also going to spend a little bit of time on water, just as a resource that we use at home. Ways to conserve water, ways to cut down your water bill, and things like that. I do want to warn you that I have packed probably way too much material into this to actually cover in the amount of time that we've got. So a fair number of these slides I'm going to just sort of look at quickly and go over with you fairly fast, and then you can use them as resources in the future. We'll have the whole slideshow up on the site so you can download it and you can review at your leisure. But I'm a believer in putting a lot of information in that then you can review later on. So we'll go through a few things fairly quickly. Some stuff I'm going to spend plenty of time on, but there'll be a few parts of this presentation where I'll just give you a very brief overview, and you can come back to it later and really kind of learn it, because there's going to be too much material to absorb all at once. But that's great. Then you'll have lots of stuff to go over as you want at leisure, as time allows. All right, so deciding what to grow. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do with things that you grow in your yard. So obviously we can grow plants to provide food for habitat, obviously attracting wildlife to the yard and just providing habitat for any kind of species, endangered species, happy little guys who are around. And then how to derive income from things that you can grow in your yard, whether those are raw materials or products that you can create in your yard and then add value to by fermenting or making medicinals, making salves, making jams and jellies and preserves and things like that. And then, yeah, we will talk about microclimate, but how plants that can be grown and just whole landscaping designs that you can use to work with the microclimate in your yard. So those are some of the choices of things that you can grow. So let's dive in a little bit in what to grow. Now, in terms of food, what kind of food plants do you want to be growing, if you're going to grow any at all? Some people aren't going to be interested in growing food plants. Others certainly will want to. So if you don't have much of a yard, this will help you decide what the best use of even a really small space would be. And I always think about choosing plants for several reasons. One is plants that would cost a lot, food that would cost a lot to buy in the store. Now, I always I'm a big fan of pesto, so I always grow a lot of basil, because basil is really expensive. It's, it's like 12 bucks, 15 bucks, $20 a pound, or even more. So I grow a little basil plantation because that's something that's expensive, but that grows well in my area. So choosing plants that would cost you a lot of money if you were going to buy them in the store, and then you can preserve them, freeze them, dry them for later in the season. Also plants that are just easy to grow. stuff that you like to grow, that grows easily in your conditions, things that are going to be pretty trouble-free and painless for you to grow. Then also just things that you love to eat. You know, I mean, obviously a lot of us who garden really like to do tomatoes, and you know, that's a particular favorite for a lot of people. So, you know, what are our favorite foods? There may be certain varieties of, you know, of vegetables that you really like, and those would make sense to grow in your yard. And then also, do you want your yard to provide you with calories, or nutrient-dense vegetables, or a combination? Because see, most vegetables don't have a lot of calories in them. Like a pound of kale has about 150 calories. So in order to get the daily minimum requirement of roughly 2,000 calories, you're going to have to eat like 13, 14 pounds of kale a day. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but they will provide a lot of minerals. But if you want to actually feed yourself calorically, then you're going to need something like potatoes or squash or grains or corn that you can make you know, grind up dry and grind for a meal, or beans that you can dry. But those are all plants that are really high in calories. And obviously you're going to need a fairly extensive yard if you want to grow calorie crops. So that's a decision that you need to make, is are you going to be wanting to grow mostly vegetables that aren't going to provide a lot of calories, but will give you a lot of mineral nutrition, vitamins, things like that, or are you going to try and get the bulk of your calories out of your yard? So these are some of the things that will help guide us towards the decisions about what kind of food plants we want to grow. You know, plants that would cost a lot to buy, things that are easy to grow, foods that you really like to grow, and what is it you're trying to provide in the way of nutrition or calories for yourself. So just to talk about high value crops for a minute, there are two ways to think about growing them. You can either grow them to reduce what you spend at the store, or you can grow stuff to generate income, where you're actually doing market gardening. And then there are things like herbs that cost a lot of money to buy, so why not grow some of those yourself? It's really easy. Also, small greens can be, you know, 10, 12, 15 bucks a pound. Those luscious little micro beans or micro greens and other types of greens. And then there are other plants that tend to get expensive even during the growing season. You know, heirloom tomatoes, 6 bucks a pound, 8 bucks a pound, that sort of thing. They're all fairly spendy. And then another crop that would have high value would be medicinal plants of all different sorts. Obviously, these prices are going to vary depending on where you are. You know, some things, you know, there could be a great abundance of, you know, maybe there are lots of people growing ginseng in your area, so it wouldn't make sense to grow that. So find out what the local prices are. And I've got a couple of really good resources here as far as if you want to actually grow food for income. A very nice book by someone who's really experienced at market gardening, at using his own yard or even borrowing neighbors' yards to grow plants or food for market. Jean-Martin Fortier, a French-Canadian fellow, and his book, The Market Gardener. Jean-Martin has had, he's not making stuff up. He's a very successful market gardener. So his book is a terrific resource. And then Curtis Stone has been doing a lot of something called spin farming, small plot intensive, where you just grow a ton of vegetables in a really small amount of space. And he is able to gross $80,000 from a quarter-acre yard per year. And it's not even, in many cases, his yard. He's able to either rent land or borrow land or work out a trade for a share of the crops, those sorts of things. So those are two really good resources, the urban farmer and the market gardener, on actually growing for a market so that you can get income from growing food in your yard. And then if you want to be growing plants for habitat, these are just basic needs for wildlife. So you want to kind of cover these bases. You need all kinds of wildlife, whether it's four-legged critters or birds or insects. They all need some kind of cover, some sort of protection, so they're not out there in the open for predators to grab. So they need places to lay eggs or hide their young. All animals need moisture of some sort. Although there are a lot of insects that they don't drink actually water, but they use nectar from plants. And then you also need food for habitat, for wildlife habitat. So that's going to be pollen from plants or things that do produce nice nectar. Obviously, flowers are the thing that's going to do that. Some wildlife are going to want to eat leaves. Others like to eat fruit. Others like to eat bugs. So, what is it you're trying to attract? There are a lot of good books on wildlife for your particular area, how to attract wildlife to your yard. And also you want a lot of diverse kinds of food so that you've got, places for these animals to be year round so that they don't suddenly run out of cover or food. And again, there are lots of really good books on wildlife gardening and habitat gardening. And then you have to ask, what do you want to attract? Do you want to, are you a bird lover, or do you want to bring in beneficial insects of different sorts? Do you like looking at butterflies? Do you want to bring in little four-legged creatures? Because there are specific things that you can grow to attract each one of these kinds of organisms. And what's nice is that a lot of the plants that we grow for habitat turn out to also have other functions. Like I've mentioned comfrey before. Yeah, it's a great insect attracting plant, but it also is medicinal. It also has mulch. It also is a nutrient accumulator. So it's a great thing is that a lot of plants that are good for habitat also could be nitrogen fixers or nutrient accumulators or human food. And there are both in Gaia's garden and also on the web, lots of lists of insect attracting plants and wildlife attracting plants. So you got tons of resources out there for habitat type plants. Then if you want to do income, if you want to be growing things for income, obviously you want to know what the market is, what sells, what are other people selling, or what are empty niches in your area, things that people aren't selling but that there might be a demand for. And it's a really good idea to choose things that are, at least when you're getting started, that are easy to grow. If you try things that are too difficult, you raise your risk of failure. So things that there's a market for and that that you can grow. Get some help, ask other people, other market gardeners. And just the idea of the fact that it's local. Local is a label that adds value. So just by saying this is locally grown, locally raised honey, locally grown medicinal plants, you've got a little extra value added there. And speaking about value added, anyone can grow plants and sell them as a raw product, but they're generally pretty low prices per pound. And so the idea is to add value somehow, to preserve them, to make jams or jellies or salves or fermented products, all kinds of preps. You can do ready-to-eat foods, things that people can take camping. There are some farmers markets near me where people make really great juices and broths, chicken broths and vegetable broths and things like that, or just little artisanal products of different sorts. And if you get good at something, like these folks who are doing really good broths at our local farmers market, they've got a niche. Everybody knows these are the people to go to get these really wonderful bone broths and chicken broths and things like that. So make a niche for yourself where you get a brand basically. And there's lots of information on how to do that. All right, now we're going to go into microclimate a little bit, because one of the nice things, again, speaking as a permaculturist, multifunctional. Microclimate plants can be food-producing plants. They can be habitat plants. They can be income-producing plants. So again, we can stack all sorts of functions in there while we are still dealing with our microclimate. And one of the big ideas for playing with microclimate in your yard is to save energy and to cut down on your resource use. Also, by creating more beneficial microclimates in your yard, nice little warm places and cool places and things like that, shady spots, you increase the amount of biodiversity. You'll create a large number of different niches in your yard, different types of little microclimates, and that will attract a broader variety of wildlife, so you can increase biodiversity. Another nice thing about managing the microclimate in your yard is that you can reduce the impact on your city's infrastructure. If you are harvesting rainwater and not just sending it down the sewer, or if you are creating more shade in your yard on hot days, then you're not going to need as much electricity for air conditioning. And you're just going to be more comfortable as well. You'll spend more time outdoors and your house will be more comfortable indoors. So that means that you get a lot more use out of your yard because of this, and it'll make your house a lot nicer as well. Plus the fact that you can lengthen the growing season and get a longer season of production for whatever it is that you're growing in your yard. So I want to talk about the basics of microclimate a little bit. I haven't even really said, what do I mean by microclimate? And the technical definition is simply the climate near the ground, as opposed to the overall climate. But what that simply means is relatively small areas that are somehow a little bit different from your overall climate. They might be a little bit warmer or cooler or more humid or drier, but in some ways is different from the general climate, or places that kind of mitigate the effects, windbreaks or shade to cool things off, those sorts of things. And microclimates form where the sun or the wind or moisture interacts with the features that are on the ground, like buildings or plantings or even roads. A dark asphalt road is going to get warm, so you might be able to plant things next to the road for the additional heat that's coming off the road. Same with a sidewalk, that can act as a thermal mass to store up heat. So microclimates form where things like sunlight or wind interact with something that's on the ground, as a windbreak or shade or those sorts of things. And the more interesting stuff you've got on the ground, the more plants, the more paths, structures, these sorts of things, then you've got more opportunities to create microclimates and play with them. So here are some things that influence microclimates. First, there are a couple basic ways. One is, how do you move heat around? How do you cool off hot places, warm up cold places, keep places that are comfortable, remaining comfortable? So there are several different ways of moving heat around. One is just what we call radiation, except that that's got connotations of radioactivity, and that's not what I mean. It's simply radiant heat, the way a hot rock radiates heat, so you can warm your hands near it. You can feel the heat coming off of things, as opposed to actually heating the air and then blowing hot air on you. It's like a radiant flooring, where they run warm water pipes through the floor, and then the floor radiates heat into the rest of the room. And the air temperature in that room can be quite chilly. But if the floor is warm, it's going to keep your feet warm, and the warmth radiating from that floor is going to warm you up, and you'll be a lot more comfortable. So there's radiant energy to move heat from one place to another, something that's warm, that's warming up something that's cool. Then another part is air mixing, like in a greenhouse. Really one of the main reasons that a greenhouse stays warm is because you don't have cold air blowing into it. It's sealed. And although, yeah, it's a heat trap, it's gathering, it's got the greenhouse effect going on there, where, light is entering the greenhouse and being converted into heat and warming it up. But really what's happening is you don't have wind blowing through the greenhouse, taking away that warm air. So keeping air from mixing, if you want to keep things warm, or if you want to cool things off, then letting air move through to mix are ways of transferring heat from one place to another. And then we've got evaporation, how on a hot day, if someone spritzes you with a little bit of water, you cool off very nicely, at least in a kind of a dry heat. So evaporation is a way of transferring heat from one place to another. And then another one that we don't use too much in creating microclimates is just conduction, where you've got a burner on a stove heating up a pan, and then the pan gets warm and transfers heat directly through conduction into the thing that's inside the pan. So those are some basic ways of moving heat around. And then there are physical factors like thermal mass, just big heavy objects that are dense can store up heat really well, like water or rocks, or even heavy clay soils or sand or things like that. They take a long time to heat up, but they take a long time to cool off. So you can store heat in thermal masses. Then there's the idea of slope. Which way is the ground pointed? If a north-facing slope in the northern hemisphere, at least, is going to be cool. and a south-facing slope in the northern hemisphere is going to be warmer. So which way is the slope facing? You can get morning sun on the east side, and that'll warm things up quicker. And then also precipitation obviously cools things off, or when it's raining, it'll rain will generally cool things off a good bit. And then also there's the idea of light reflection, the fact that a bright colored wall will reflect light, kind of bounce light into things. Like if you put a pond in the northern hemisphere on the south side of a greenhouse, that pond actually will bounce light into the greenhouse and help keep it warmer, as well as providing more light for plants to grow. And these are all of these 8 different factors are all things that we can play with in order to create really nice microclimates. Warm up cool spaces and cool off hot spaces, as I've said a few times. So I'm going to go through these few slides fairly quickly here, but I've talked about radiant energy a little bit, and we just want to, mostly the source of radiant energy for most purposes is the sun. So, get rid of shade where you want to warm things up and create shade where you want to cool things off. And then use this idea of thermal masses to capture the sun's radiant energy and store it. Or you can put up shady things or create barriers to radiant heat flow, like walls and curtains and things like that. All right. And then this idea of air mixing. What I have here in the illustration here is what we call a U-shaped sun trap, where this is opens towards the sun. So in the northern hemisphere, this would be opening towards the south. And it creates this nice little bowl in here. It's a windbreak, plus heat just builds up in the center of it and creates this much warmer environment with this little U-shaped windbreak. And I actually live in one of these. I didn't build it myself, but there are a bunch of trees surrounding about 2 acres or so. It's actually a really big U-shaped sun trap that opens to the south, and it is so much warmer and more comfortable inside that U-shaped sun trap than it is outside. So these are just some techniques that we can use for creating nice little microclimates, but creating these U-shaped sun traps is a really great way to just make your yard a lot more habitable. And imagine if there's a house in the middle of this, how nice and toasty warm that house is going to stay, which you may want if you're in a cool climate. Obviously in a hot climate, we're going to want to do something else and cool things down. So I've mentioned, again, here are different tools for creating evaporation, misters and sprayers and fountains and dehumidifiers, and also something called a swamp cooler, which is simply a mass of something wet that has air blowing through it. You put a fan behind a moist curtain or a mossy wall or something like that. And at least in a dry climate, swamp coolers are a way of really cooling things off really nicely, because as the warm, dry air blows through this wet thing that's inside a ventilated box, is essentially what it is. It cools it off, cools the air off, and those really work. Swamp coolers are sort of the precursor to an air conditioner, and they're low cost. So learn about swamp coolers if you want to cool yourself off in a dry climate. They don't work so well in humid climates because you've got to get evaporation going. All right, and then I've mentioned thermal mass, so here's a good list of all sorts of types of thermal mass and ways to use thermal mass. They warm up during the day and then they radiate heat back at night. That's really the whole deal. I remember in the 1970s, there were these sort of solar energy nuts who would put in 55-gallon water tanks that were painted black, and they'd put these on a south-facing glass wall of their house. Looked kind of ugly, but the 55-gallon tanks would heat up during the day and then radiate that heat back at night and keep the house a lot more comfortable. So use of thermal mass to keep places more comfy. And then I've mentioned slope as an important, which way is the land facing, and also just about air drainage is really important too. You don't want to be at the base of a slope when things are cool, because the cool air is going to drain down that slope and then pool down at the bottom of it. That's what we call a frost pocket down at the bottom of a slope. So it's not a pleasant place to be. If you look at where the old pioneer homesteads are, they're never at the bottom of a slope. They're usually about a third of the way up a little slope, well, depending on how big the slope is, but they're up off the bottom so that there's air moving past the place and not just pooling up around it. So they put their gardens and fruit trees not down on the flat where cold air pools, but they put them on a little bit of a slope so that air will keep draining past it. So if you have a slope with a big hedge down at the bottom of it or something like that, that hedge can actually act as a trap to trap cold air and make things a lot less pleasant down there. And then I've mentioned rainfall, and here are just some different techniques. There's something called a fog broom. If you live in a foggy climate, you can actually harvest quite a bit of water through putting up like a big piece of shade cloth, or where I live, the trees, the cypress trees and pine trees and eucalyptus trees actually harvest enormous amount of water off of the fog. It rains underneath them on foggy days. There are people who put down rock mulches, just kind of pebbles, or small, fist size to thumb size rocks. And those chill down at night, and then dew forms on them, and the dew drains into the soil and can actually act as a way to harvest water. And keeping things cool into the spring so that plants don't flower too early. Fruit trees in particular, like apricots, are notorious for setting their blooms too early. So sometimes you want to keep places cold into the spring. So near snowdrifts and snow banks is one place to do that. Or again, in the northern hemisphere, the northeast corner of a lot of properties can be the coldest part of the property because it gets a little bit of morning sun where it's still cold, and then for the rest of the day it is often in shade. So that those northeast corners in the northern hemisphere will stay cool later into the season, so you can keep fruit trees from blossoming too early. And then what happens is that a late frost will kill the blossoms and you won't get any fruit. And obviously hail will damage plants. That's one form of precipitation that growers do not like. And then I've also mentioned this idea of brightness. Light colored surfaces stay cooler, but they'll reflect light, and dark colored surfaces absorb light and then convert it to heat, and then that heat then radiates from it. So again, you'll have plenty of time to reread all this stuff. I know I'm roaring through it. Just want to really introduce these concepts, and then you can take a look at them as you want. So here's just a recap of all the different things that we can play with. We have many, many variables to mess with to improve our microclimates and to enhance the ones that are already pretty nice. And by doing that, you can help save energy. So I've got a long list here of ways that you can warm up a cool yard. I'm not going to go through all of these. But just here's a nice list of a whole bunch of different techniques of how you can keep a cool yard warmer so that you can hang out later in the evening and hang out later in the into the fall and get out there earlier in the springtime. Lots of different things. Properly pruning trees to let sunlight in. This last thing, creating overhangs. Like I'll often prune trees up to about 6 to 8 feet off the ground so that I can be underneath the trees and the low winter sun will come in under the tree. This would be more like a conifer tree that still has needles on it during the winter time. And then the low sun can get in underneath the tree, but the protection of that tree canopy over me keeps things warmer, so it traps heat underneath it. So there are just all these great techniques for changing the temperature in your yard. If the problem is that you've got a hot yard, if you live in a warm climate, here's an even longer list of all kinds of things that you can do to cool off a warm yard or keep it from getting too hot. Like item number 2 there, keeping thermal mass in shade. You don't want big piles of masonry and rock walls and things like that to heat up, because that's just it's gonna cook. I remember walking past a brick building in Phoenix one afternoon, and it was just radiating heat from this building. You could just feel this like blast wave coming off of it because all that thermal mass was just catching heat and radiating it away. So a nice long list of ways that you can cool off a warm yard. So, all right, so the whole point of microclimate management, well, there are 2. One is to make the yard more comfortable for you to hang out in and more comfortable for plants to be in. But the other one is to save energy, so that your home energy bills are reduced because you've already taken care of a lot of the temperature and wind issues before those temperatures and winds have even made it to your house. So that's the reason that we're playing with microclimate, is to lower our energy bills. So I want to spend a little bit of time on energy and just how to think about energy from a permacultural point of view. My newer book, The Permaculture City, actually has a chapter on energy that a little bit of this is taken from. But if you want to know more about energy from a permaculture point of view, that book, The Permaculture City, really goes into a lot of detail about energy. Gaia's Garden, not so much, but I want to spend some time on it with you. So what do we use energy to do? What do we do with the energy that we consume? A lot of it is heating and cooling, creating heat and then moving it to where we want it, or we move things. A lot of that is taking a spinning motor and turning that into linear motion somehow, so that we can, saw something or push something. But motors spin, and so somehow you need to convert that into linear motion. We also use energy to expand gases, to push a piston. That's what you're doing in your car engine. And also we use fluids like hydraulics to push things around. Pumps are another way that we move things using energy, fans and turbines, all of those sorts of things. So we use energy to move stuff. So we move heat, we move stuff, and we also move electrons in circuits. Those are really the three major things that we do with energy. So again, if we want to think permaculturally, I always start with function. What functions does this serve? Because then we can go on to, all right, how can we make sure that we're using the right energy sources in a way that's going to be efficient, that we're making wise choices about what kind of energy to use to do the jobs that we want to do. So here's how we use energy, and this is just a comparison from 1978 to 2005 of US energy use. You can see that the biggest thing in 1978 was space heating. About 66% of our energy was used to heat space, and we've actually become a lot more efficient. We only use 41% of our energy to heat space now. What's very interesting in this graphic, the reason I wanted to show it was because we're actually using almost exactly the same amount of energy that we were using in 1978, or at least in 2005. Those are, for some odd reason, the most recent numbers I could come up with. But we were using 10.58 quadrillion British thermal units in 1978, and now we're using 10.55. So just about exactly the same amount of energy, but the big growth area in energy consumption is appliances and electronics. We pretty much doubled the amount of electricity or just energy that we're using for appliances. And of course, that's because we've all got, these things and this thing that I'm working with right now that people didn't really have much of in 1978, computers. And then the other big one is air conditioning. We air condition, we use air conditioning for at least twice as many things as we did in 1978. So we're doing heating a lot more efficiently, but we're using a lot more energy to cool things and to push electrons around. So the miracle story about energy, really, this is kind of a fun little excursion into history, is that a big part of why the human species has been so successful in terms of just spreading across an entire planet and colonizing pretty much all of it, is that particularly the last few centuries, we've reduced the cost of getting work done. We've found more and more sources of energy that are less and less expensive. 10,000 years ago, pretty much all work was done by human beings. And then we domesticated animals. So for several thousand years, a bunch of thousand years, we used animals as a source of energy, as well as firewood. And then a few hundred years ago, we started using coal. And then a little over 100 years ago, we started using oil. And this has drastically reduced the cost of getting work done because fossil fuels are so cheap relatively. And just an example of how much less the getting work done costs now is looking at travel. And just an example is that my earliest American ancestor, Ralph Hemmenway, came over from Manchester, England in about 1630. And he sailed one of those ships like in the lower left or rode as a passenger. He actually, in order to pay for his passage, he indentured himself as a servant to a man in Boston. And he had to work for him for free for 4 years to pay for his passage to America. So 4 years of labor to pay for one ocean voyage. And if you think about what it costs to fly from Europe to America or vice versa now, it's less than a week's pay for most people. So not 4 years of being an indentured servant, but only a week of being an indentured servant, essentially. So I mean, that's a tremendous reduction in cost. And that's really behind the success of the human species, is the cost of getting work done has just plummeted to a fraction of what it was. So I want to go through some numbers just to show you the miracle that we have of cheap energy. Each person in the overdeveloped world, the US and Europe and Australia, New Zealand, these countries have roughly what they call, I know it's not a politically correct term, but they talk about energy slaves. You have the equivalent of 100 people working for you just in the fossil fuel that you have available to you. And in Europe, it's a little bit less. It's about 60 or 70 people. The US here, we use a lot of energy. So we have the equivalent of 100 people working for us because of the amount of oil and fossil fuel energy that we have. So how does this break down? If you could work all day fairly steadily, doing something like, like gardening or, some physical labor that was not overwhelming, like framing a house, something like that. You'd work at the rate of putting out about 250 watts per hour or so. That's kind of a steady, reasonable energy output for a person. A gallon of gasoline, in comparison, has 33,700 watt hours in it. So 1 gallon of gasoline has way more energy in it than you can use, that you can put out in an hour. That's just an interesting little figure. So if you think that gasoline, at least right now in America, costs about $3 a gallon, I know it's more expensive in other countries. The average American wage right now is about $25 an hour. So you can buy 8 gallons of gasoline for working for an hour at $3 per gallon. And so this down in the blue here, if you get 8 gallons of gasoline for an hour's worth of work, that means if you got 33,000 watt hours in a gallon of gas, you're buying 8 gallons of gas for an hour of labor, you can buy 269,000 watt hours of work for 1 hour of labor. So putting out 250 watts of your labor is going to buy you 269,000 watt hours of work done by fuel. I mean, that's incredible that we have this much energy available to us. It's astounding that we get this trade. It's like, it's like putting a quarter into a slot machine and getting $26,000 out of it every single time you pop a quarter into a slot machine. It's an unbelievable bargain that we've got in energy right now. So let's use it wisely, because it's a non-renewable resource as far as fossil fuels are concerned. So this is the key to our success, is we've got really cheap, really dense energy sources. A gallon of gasoline, just one little tiny gallon, has got all this energy in it. If you were going to try and produce the same amount of energy using a photovoltaic panel, typical small panel is about 120 watts. So that panel would have to sit in the sun for 240 hours in order to produce the same amount of energy in 1 gallon of gasoline. So, a 120 watt panel costs about, well, it's a little bit less now. It's about $200 or so. And gas is $3 a gallon. So that just shows you what a bargain we've got. The only caveat there is that solar panel is still producing energy after it's, after it's produced that initial 33,000 watt hours, whereas the gallon of gasoline is gone. So there's still some advantages, but this is the bargain we've got. It's unbelievable. And just to go through one more cool little number, I'm a numbers geek, and so excuse me for taking a little excursion into this. But another measure of energy is the British thermal unit, and a barrel of oil holds 5.8 million BTUs. And a human being working at a moderate pace, I said 250 watts, that works out to be about the same as 750 BTUs. So what that means is that one barrel of oil has the same amount of energy in it as 7,733 hours of a person working. And if you were to pay somebody $25 an hour to perform the work that is done in a $40 barrel of oil, you would have to pay them $193,000 to get the same human energy that is contained in a $40 barrel of oil. In other words, you'd have to work 2 to 10 years of 8-hour days, depending on how hard you could work, to replace the energy in one barrel of oil. So that's the miracle that we have in fossil fuels. So yes, let's use it wisely. So to make these sorts of decisions, I like to think of energy as a sector. It's an influence coming into my life from outside somewhere. And the way to work with sectors like wind or sun or any of these, there are 3 basic things you can do. You can harvest them, you can block them, or you can just let it go by without doing anything to it. So if we think of energy as a sector, then one thing we can do is use passive strategies first. In other words, harvest energy passively, block energy through something that's just going to sit there and block the energy rather than something that's got power. Another way that we talk about this in permaculture is we try to use, we use passive strategies before active ones. We use things that just sit there as opposed to things that have a lot of moving parts. And if we can't do the job with something passive, then we move over to active. So passive strategies for saving energy would be to keep heat where we want it. We're using insulation and weather stripping and keeping air from leaking away. And as I've mentioned, managing the exterior microclimate through plants and windbreaks and things like that. Thermal mass is a passive energy strategy. And then, control how much sun and shade we've got through things like window blinds and proper location of our house with relation to the sun, plantings and things like that. So, we try and use these passive strategies first. And just ways, so here are some ways of doing this that would be blocking the sectors, like insulating, weather stripping, and then harvesting the sector types of energy strategies would be like using the sun to dry your clothes or for heating air. Basically using sun to do gentle warming jobs. That's something the sun is really good at, is to warm things slightly. So anytime you need to just warm things up, something up a little bit, think about using solar energy for doing that. And so I'm just, so what I've done here on these next few slides is just give you lists of ways to use these passive energy strategies. So I'm just going to move through these fairly quickly. And again, you can read them at your leisure. This idea of storing heat with thermal masses. And here are just some different types of thermal mass. Remember that water is very much a thermal mass. So a pond or a water tank will affect the temperature that's around it. And then this idea of controlling the sun or the shade. Here's an illustration just showing a roof overhang, that if you've got a decent, the right size roof overhang, what will happen is that it'll block the summer sun coming in so that you don't get heat in your house during the summer when you don't want it. And then during the winter time, that when the sun is much lower in the sky, you have, that roof overhang is just sized right, usually 18 inches to 2 feet or so that sun will come in through the windows. And it's a nice passive strategy for blocking the unwanted summer sun, but allowing in that much needed winter sun. And then obviously insulating everything is another part of that passive strategy. So here's a whole list with some guidelines for, if you are building a house or remodeling a house, how to figure out how many windows you should have and how much thermal mass you should have. That's essentially what this slide is telling you, is guidelines for using, for developing passive strategies in terms of capturing sunlight and keeping sun out of places that you don't want it. Right. And then, okay, so here's an interesting little set of facts is that the sun is at the same angle on September 21st and on March 21st. So, you know, that thick arrow there shows that it's in this intermediate angle. The summer solstice sun is really high in the sky, June 21st, and the winter solstice sun, December 21st, it's really low in the sky. So you've got your roof overhang sized. You have to make a choice. Like, do you want the September sun to come in, or do you want to block it? Because the thing is that winter and summer are pretty much an easy decision to make, but in the spring and fall, the sun is at the same angle on those two dates, September 21st and March 21st, except that it's often pretty hot in September if you're not too far north, but it's still usually pretty darn chilly in March. So which do you choose? Do you want to block the hot summer sun, which would also block the nice warming March sun? So the answer to that is you put up a trellis, because in March, the leaves on that trellis, and again, this is Northern Hemisphere, excuse my bias for the Northern Hemisphere, but that very few things are leafed out by March 21st. You know, grapes certainly wouldn't be, kiwis, things like that. Even, you know, deciduous passion flowers, they're not going to leaf out by March 21st, but they will still have leaves on them on September 21st. So you have this biological strategy now coupling with your passive roof overhang strategy, so that now you can keep out the September sun, but let in the March sun and remain comfortable. So there's these great little strategies for conserving energy, where we combine a passive method with a biological method of a trellis. And just here's a design for a window-mounted solar collector, something you can build yourself. And if you want more construction details, I've got more in my book, The Permaculture City. Also, you can just Google this, but it's something that you can put in a standard overhung type window that will, you know, bring cool air out of the house and heat it up and bring it back in as warm air. So now we've got active methods, now that we've gone through all these passive energy methods. And so here again, just a whole set of things that we do to save energy, where we look at which appliances are using the most energy and gradually try and upgrade those. What are the locally abundant energy sources? Like, I was up in Boise, Idaho a while ago, and it turns out that Boise has hot springs all underneath it. So a lot of their buildings are heated essentially for free by the hot springs that are underneath the city. So that would be a locally abundant energy source. Maybe you live in an area where there's a lot of coal. Coal is not a great energy source, but if it's locally abundant, that may guide you to what to use. Obviously, if sun is abundant in your area, or wind, those are really good choices to make. So yeah, we want to think about what renewable sources are available. And then we're also always wanting to be prepared for if we've got an outage or shortages, those sorts of things. And it's always nice to have a small scale emergency setup. Like, I have we do live in it's a grid tie solar house. So we've got a whole bunch of solar panels that power our house, but we don't have a battery system. We're tied into the grid. And so when we have a power failure, our power goes off, even though we have solar panels. But I have one separate little solar panel that I do have a battery hooked up to. And if we do have a long power outage, and I live out in the country, so sometimes that happens, I can charge my computer off of it. I can, you know, run some lights off of it. This one little panel with a battery, and then I've got a little $100 inverter to convert the battery DC voltage to AC. So you can, you know, that cost me maybe $300 for this whole little backup energy system, that when we do have a longer power failure, I can run the really important things that I need to run. And then, you know, again, as I've said, matching your energy source to their best use. And again, there's more detail on this in my book, The Permaculture City. But here I'll tell you a little bit about it. You know, just a basic one that's kind of funny is, you know, have you already got something that's hot? Then use that to generate heat, rather than starting a new, you know, and setting something on fire to generate new heat. So this is where this geothermal energy, hot spring energy comes from. or solar energy, or a lot of cities have got waste industrial heat that they're able to capture somehow. Or maybe you're running an engine somewhere. There are folks who use compost piles to generate heat. There's a wonderful man in Milwaukee, Will Allen, who runs an outfit called Growing Power, where they take a fair amount of the city's municipal compost and they pile it up against their greenhouses. And it was well below freezing when I visited them in February, but the greenhouse was in the mid 70s Fahrenheit. Because they had all this compost piled up against the sides of it, and it kept it really nice and warm. So, where are you generating heat? Transfer that heat to somewhere that you want it to be used. Solar is more useful than you think in a lot of cloudy areas. And also then what fuels are going to be good to use. Like, it's crazy to use electricity to heat something. Electricity is really good for moving electrons around, but the idea of, most electricity is made already by heating something. You run a nuclear power plant or a coal plant or an oil-fired plant, generate a whole bunch of heat to make steam, to spin a turbine, to generate a current. And then on the other end, that current then comes and is turned back into heat in your radiant electric space heater. It's crazy to do it that way. This is where these high density fuels, including wood, make a lot of sense to use. And same with mechanical energy. If you got something that's spinning or moving, then hook it up. A lot of old factories would have one single big motor, and they would run a huge number of machines off of that one motor, put a whole bunch of pulleys and gears, and use one large motor to propel a whole bunch of different machines. All right, I want to talk about one really cool form of heating called rocket mass heaters, which are a new development, but there's a really old kind called masonry stoves. And these are stoves that have a lot of thermal mass in them. Like the bottom picture there is a masonry stove. You can see it's thousands of pounds of bricks with a relatively small burning chamber in it. And then a rocket mass heater, this really cool looking earthen bench here. You can see on the upper left photo, there's a 55-gallon drum that's painted black. That's a heat exchanger or heat riser. And you have a little fire right below that. You can see this kind of blackened area. Oops, sorry about that, just popped out. Let's get back in, there we go. There's a little tiny burning chamber where you put a little bit of wood, little twigs, and really small pieces of scrap. And the heat from that is transferred in by the heat exchanger, and then it runs through that great big bench there. There are actually stovepipes in the bench, and the bench is warmed up. And by the time the gases from the stove make it out of the stovepipe, it's just about completely cool. Like, you can put your hand over the stovepipe and you'll get a little bit of warming, and a little bit of condensation will form because they burn unbelievably clean, almost non-measurable amounts of carbon monoxide off of it. There is CO2 and there's water, but you can run these stoves with twigs, with really small pieces of wood, which means that if you have even a reasonable size yard, you can actually grow the fuel that you need to heat your small house using one of these rocket mass heaters or with a masonry stove. Masonry stoves aren't quite as efficient, but they're pretty darn good. So I want to just talk for a minute about these techniques of how to grow fuel in your own yard, something called coppicing and pollarding. Let's see, there we go. Why is this going backwards? Okay, there we go. So these two words, coppice and pollard, are two old English words that just have to do with choosing particular species of plants that like to put up stump sprouts that sucker really easily. So these would include things like maple or eucalyptus, alders, chestnuts. I've got a list there. There are lots of species that do this. And what you do is coppice is where you cut these, you cut the trunk off right at the ground, and it'll put up a whole bunch of shoots like this, as you can see in the photo there in the upper right. And they talk about it taking 7 to 20 years. That's much longer than I've known. Usually 2 to 3 years you can get wood that's an inch or two in diameter, which is plenty big for one of these rocket stoves. And then pollarding on the lower right, it's really ugly. You'll see it done on a lot of street trees, but it's where you cut off at the major fork. You chop a tree off where the first major crotch is, or where big branches start to come out, and it'll put out a whole bunch of little shoots. And you can use this after 2 to 5 years or so for fuel. So you can generate an enormous amount of wood. I mean, you see that one, whatever it is, beech or alder or something there that guy is pruning. That's a huge amount of wood coming from one plant. And with a highly efficient rocket stove, rocket mass heater, you'll be able to heat the better part of the season off of that one plant, depending on how cold your season is, if you live in a small, well-insulated house. So I just wanted to introduce you to this idea of coppicing and pollarding. And we'll spend a little bit of time on water. One of the last things that we're going to go over tonight. The right name for this planet actually is not Earth. We should be calling this planet water, because there's 70% water and only 30% land mass. The thing is that most of it is salt water, so we don't really have direct access to be able to use it. And here is a really cool graphic that the US Geological Survey put out, showing that if you took all the water on the planet and rolled it up into a little ball, that larger blue ball there is all of the planet's water in comparison to the diameter of the Earth. And the smaller ball is the amount of liquid fresh water that is on the planet. So that's all the water vapor in the atmosphere, all the water that's in soils. And then the teeny little dot of blue there is the water that's in open sources, freshwater lakes and rivers. So it's not much water. There's very little water available to us. So again, just like with high density fuel, we want to be good to our water sources. There's not a lot of it in comparison to how many people there are on the planet and how much water we use. So I think of the permaculture tool as the zone system in how to decide how much, where to use water. And what I mean by that is you can arrange your plants by what I think of as water zones. In other words, where do you have a source of water, like a faucet or a downspout, or a pond, or even a bird bath, something like that. Like we have a bird bath out in our yard, and my wife keeps it full of water, and some of it splashes because the birds go in there and splash the water around. So we've got a nice little green patch underneath the bird bath. So that's a perfect place to grow stuff because it's watered automatically by the birds. But so zone 1 in terms of water would be where you have a source of water. Also, you can arrange plants by microclimates. In other words, you have little depressions and low spots that are going to stay moist, or have you perhaps dug a swale or a shady spot. Those are going to be more moist, or winds that are going to dry things out. You want to avoid those, or put desert type plants or water conserving plants in those. And then also just the plant's natural water need. How drought tolerant is it? If it's very drought tolerant, then it can go a ways away from you because you're not going to need to water it as often. You're not going to need to keep an eye on it. And then the things that need more water should go closer to where you are so you can keep an eye on them. And that would be kind of the distance from the house or the center. And then there's also soil type to think about. If you have more than one soil type, then the heavy clay soil is going to hold more moisture. So you won't need to water that as often. So things that, that maybe use more water, or plants that use more water can go in the clay soils, and plants that don't need as much water can go in sandy or silty soils because those are going to dry out faster. And so, we can think of water use in terms of sectors as well. Just again, these influences that come from off the site. And sectors that influence water then would be like, where do the hot winds come from? In the wintertime, something that a lot of people don't think about, but if you're in a high desert climate like New Mexico or parts of Arizona, you can get really cold, really dry winds that desiccate plants in the wintertime. You don't think of things drying out in winter, but in those high dry climates that are windy, that is absolutely a factor. And then rainstorms would be a sector coming from outside. Shade, your neighbor's house or a tree that you aren't going to cut down would be, you could think of that as a sector because you can't really do much with it. And then water that comes from off your site. Your neighbors might have an overhead sprinkler, or the water running down the gutter in the street or running off of the sidewalk. You can't really change what your neighbors are doing or where the street is, but you can collect water from there. And then where is the sun going to be? Over the seasons. In June, the sun hits very different places than where it does in December. So you want to pay attention to that. Things that might be nice and cool and shady in March could be baking in the sun in August. So the sun sector is important. Places that are prone to floods, and low spots and high spots. These are all you can think of as sectors, because you can't really change them very much yourself, but they definitely affect how you're going to use water. And then just some simple techniques for working with water. We got rain barrels, which aren't going to provide you with a lot of water, but there are some special uses for water in rain barrels that I'm going to go into in a minute. But you can stack a whole bunch of rain barrels together, like this illustration on the right. That's about 300 gallons of rainwater, which, that's a reasonable amount. Or if you really want to actually scale up and have usable amounts of water, you can do water tanks. And these tanks in the bottom are slimline tanks, which you can actually use them themselves as a wall, or you can put them up against a wall. And they also can really help moderate microclimate as well, because they're going to be full of water that cools off at night, warms up during the day, and the tanks themselves will act as a windbreak. So you're stacking a whole bunch of functions. They are expensive. Water tanks in general are about 50 cents a gallon in the US. A 5,000 gallon tank is like $2,000. So, but these slimline tanks are even more expensive. So they're a spendy item. And then just some calculations for you of how much water you can actually catch. And the numbers are actually really large. I just picked this town of Sacramento. It's a fairly dry area. They only get 18 inches of rain a year, or half a meter or so of rain per year. Just one of the figures that you can keep in your mind is that an inch of rain falling on 1,000 square feet of roof is going to catch about 625. It ends up being 625 gallons. So that means if you live in a fairly typical house with 1,500 square feet of roof, you can actually, if you get 18 inches of rain a year, you can catch 16,000 plus gallons of rain per year. That's a lot of rain. That's certainly going to take care of your household needs. And then a quarter-acre yard at 18 inches of rain can catch about 112,000 gallons a year of rain. So you can catch a lot of water on a roof. I mean, just think of your roof as a ready-made water catchment device. All right, so here are some, just good reasons to be catching water like this. One of them, that number 3 there, best for starting seeds. That's what you can do with water in a rain barrel. If you only get 30 gallons or 50 gallons, that's not going to go very far if you're going to water plants with it. But rainwater speeds up plant germination. There have been experiments done, and I've certainly seen it myself, where if I use straight rainwater to water my new little seedlings where I'm germinating seeds, they come up much faster and much higher germination rates than if I use tap water. So if you only have a little bit of rainwater that you can catch, use it for germinating your seeds. Okay, and then there's drip irrigation. That would be the obvious thing to do to save water, one of many. And 2 books by my neighbor, Robert Corrick. He's really got some of the best books on drip irrigation around, so here are a couple of resources for you. And they've actually done research showing that drip irrigation can actually increase plant yields over overhead sprinkling. So there are lots of good reasons to use drip. And then here's a whole list of many, many different kinds of strategies, just all the different ways that you can combine strategies to save water. And again, I will leave these with you. Gaia's Garden goes through these in quite a bit of detail in the water chapter. So those of you who have that book, you can read all about this and see all these strategies for water harvesting. And then there's the idea of gray water, water from the laundry or the shower that can be reused as is to irrigate plants, as long as you're not using borax or bleach. Those you don't want to put on plants, but regular shower water or laundry water from even fairly conventional detergents turns out to be perfectly good for irrigating plants. And here's a really good resource for learning about gray water and building gray water systems. Art Ludwig in his book, Create an Oasis with Gray Water. And there's his website, oasisdesign.net. Really, the website I highly recommend going to. It's a wealth of information on reusing gray water to irrigate landscapes. One of the simplest things you can do to reuse gray water is what's called laundry to landscape. It's now legal to do without you don't even need a permit in a large number of the states in the US. And it's simply hooking up your washing machine to actively pump water out into your yard to where it's needed. The washing machine has a pump in it, and so you can just pump water directly out to your fruit trees. You don't want to pump too far upslope, maybe a couple feet, but no more than that, or you'll burn out the pump in your washing machine, which you don't want to do. But it's a way to actually move water actively out to where it's needed. So laundry to landscape, you can Google that, or you can look it up in Art Ludwig's books, and there are lots of great videos on how to do it on YouTube. And then if you want to clean up water even more, if say you're going to be doing something more than just irrigating, like if you want it to go into a pond, that's when you can build constructed wetlands, which are essentially, well, it's a little wetland with reeds and rushes. And I'm not going to go into any details here. I just want to let you know that this is a way to clean up water. You can't put gray water straight into a pond, from your laundry or your shower, or it's just going to get nasty really fast. Within 2 days, it will start to really stink. So you need to clean it up using plants is the way nature does it. And you can build these little constructed wetlands and then clean up water, and then it can go into a pond from gray water. You got to clean it up some if you want to use it in a pond. And many benefits for reusing water, using gray water. Just lots of good reasons to do it. Okay, wow, that took us through a whole bunch of material. Just ways of thinking about energy and resources to save money, save resources, and do all sorts of great things. So I just want to give you the homework assignment for next time. And just this idea of, what I want to be able to do with this course for you is to give you some guidance on designing your own landscape. Picking out just a few, obviously we don't have time to do a full-on permaculture design, but what we can do is pick out a few things that will help you towards creating a design. And that's why I gave you that guild assignment, and thanks for those. There were some really cool guilds in there. Just so that now you know something about guilds. And I want to do the same thing with this homework for our final class. Hard to believe we are already drawing to a close. But the assignment then is to if you haven't already done a base map, make one of a place that you're thinking of designing, your home or a friend's home or family's home, something like that, and just make a basic map. If you've already done that, then that's just great. And then make a couple of lists. One is, what are the major challenges of this site? Is it dry? Is it windy? Is it flood prone? Is there heavy clay soil, which could be a challenge, maybe not. So what are things that might be challenging there? Do you not have any time to work on it? Just what are the various possible challenges at the site? And then what are the positives? What are the really good features, which could be resources that are available? Maybe there is really cool fruit trees already growing there, or bamboo growing there that you can use to build things with, useful features of some sort. And then think of what you want your design to do. What would the goal be, or goals? You can have more than one. Do you want there to be food or habitat, or is it there to make you a little bit more self-reliant? Do you want to get income from it? Do you want to do market gardening? So what are some of the goals of your design? So there's your homework assignment for next time.